Production of New Hampshire Tonight is made possible in part by grants from Chubb Life America, a member of the Chubb Group of insurance companies, which provides property, casualty, life, and health protection through independent agents and brokers. NYNEX, making the world of communications a whole lot simpler. And Bank of New Hampshire, with a complete range of mortgage options, all serviced right here in New Hampshire.
When it comes to state support for education, New Hampshire ranks far below any other state. Critics say our reliance on property taxes to pay for schools means some students get a much better education than others. But those who defend the New Hampshire system say education takes more than money. They say we have the results to prove it. Education, do you get what you pay for on New Hampshire Tonight?
Live from the Broadcast Center at New Hampshire Public Television, this is New Hampshire Tonight, with host Richard Ager, also with reporter Barbara Coles.
Those who saw the documentary that ran immediately before this program saw two very different schools in New Hampshire, one in Franklin and one less than an hour away in Amherst. The stark contrast between the rundown school in Franklin and the shiny facility in Amherst illustrates a simple point. In an educational system that relies on local property taxes for support, the poorer communities will have to make do with less. But does their lack of computers and other learning tools make for a poorer education? And should that situation be changed? We'll take your calls on who should pay for education in a few moments. You can call the number on your screen at any time. And for some time, I guess the question in New Hampshire has been, should we change the way we fund education? Our first guest here to discuss that issue is Ovide Lamontagne, Chairman of the State Board of Education. So, Ovide, is the way we do it just fine?
I think it's the best system in the country, frankly. I think New Hampshire can be proud of the system we have taken as a whole, looking at it in context. And I believe that we are going to continue to show that New Hampshire students will rank at the top tier of the country over time because of the system we have in place, the public funding system and the delivery system. If we're going to change anything, it ought to be on the delivery system. And I think if that program shows anything, choice in education is probably the most important way we can change education to lead to meaningful results.
Oh, thank you. Our next guest is Dennis Murphy, a lobbyist for the New Hampshire chapter of the National Education Association. Dennis, I assume you'd like to see some changes?
Oh, I think there will be changes in the way we fund education in the state of New Hampshire, and the question is when. I think the Supreme Court made that quite clear in its decision on the Claremont case, and thus far the political leadership in the state seems to be ignoring those issues. And what's going to happen is one way or another the playing field will be leveled in the state of New Hampshire, and that those children, like the children in Franklin, will one way or another be given a better educational opportunity than they're receiving now.
Well, also joining us tonight is Doug Hall, a former state representative who has spent a lot of time on education and budget issues. Doug, what's your sense on this? Should we change the way we fund education?
Yeah, I've felt for a long time that we really do need to change the way we fund education. We need to equalize the opportunities, at least at the local level. And the interesting thing to me about the report that was aired was that it seems real clear that the kids who are going to the schools understand that.
Well, Ovide, I'd like to start with you because less than a year ago, the state Supreme Court found that the state does have a duty to provide an adequate education. And anybody who saw the program saw that in a computer age, that often does mean computers for the school or at least textbooks that aren't out of date. So I'm wondering, what's your feeling about this?
Well, first of all, I think there's been a misrepresentation about what the Supreme Court has said, both by Mr. Merrow in his report and right now by Mr. Murphy. The fact is the Supreme Court has simply said there is a duty, a legal duty on the part of the state to guarantee adequate funding for education and to deliver an adequate education. It has not said there's anything wrong with the present system. And Mr. Merrow was wrong to to suggest otherwise in his report. New Hampshire, by the way, has 9.5 students per computer, which is very much in the running as far as the top tier of the country, and that's with our present funding of education. Yes, it's true that we are seeing changes in technology and so forth, but before we can even access that technology, we can't overlook the fact that children need to read, they need to write, they need to be able to know how to compute and how to do basic math, and those things will never change. And so until we get those basics down and we do it well, I think the rest of it becomes really secondary.
I think one of the things that came out this week in that study was the fact that about 60% of those computers are outdated. And perhaps many of them have a better use as a boat anchor than as a computer.
I would suggest
outdated
that.
technology in our schools, and we need to do something about it. And the state of New Hampshire has had opportunities to do so. We can debate whether we need to change the entire tax structure. That debate can rage forever. But in the meantime, we can begin to target some resources to make technology available. We could use Goals 2000 money to make technology available to the poorer school districts. There's all kinds of things we could do, but yet I stay around the State House day after day, and there seems to be an insistence on doing absolutely nothing.
Well, that's just not the case. I mean, we have done a lot.
Ovid's correct in trying to articulate what the Supreme Court has and hasn't said today. It's said that the state has a responsibility. It has not yet said one way or the other whether the current system of funding is constitutional. And for all the technology issues and the arguments about how many computers in the classroom, and there was some focus on that in the report before, it does seem to me that probably the most important factor is the student-teacher ratio. And the quality of teaching that goes on in the classroom is supplemented by whatever technology, whatever materials are available. And I think the differences in the student-teacher ratio, which the report highlighted, are much more important than the question of the technology. I'm not minimizing the question of technology, but the student-teacher ratio does vary considerably among the school districts, and that means how much personal attention kids are getting.
Well, let's go to our first caller here, because we have Kathleen from Pennacook. Go ahead, Kathleen.
Hi. My problem is I want to know, why are there no funds for gifted children and only funds for the below IQ averages? I'm dealing with the school district that promised me that they had gifted programs, and I moved here from out of state, and there's nothing here. And, my son's not being challenged at the level he should be challenged. So I'm wondering which school district, if you can point me in the right direction, or.
Well, Doug, you'd like to address that?
I was going to say to her that I think your situation is one in which where you live is going to be what will determine whether or not there are special programs available for gifted kids. A couple years ago, I co-sponsored a bill in the legislature to provide for some state money for a gifted and talented program for kids. And it was defeated. I mean, we couldn't even get $50,000 from the state to support those kinds of activities. But some school districts do invest in that area, not all. And I think if she wants to provide for special programs for her children or her child, that she needs to look around at the different school districts and ask them specifically what they offer. She may have to move.
Well, doesn't this all get back to what the students were saying, that money equals opportunity, Ovid?
Well, I think, first of all, I resent the fact that somebody like Mr. Murrow would exploit the students. If you ask a student whether or not they prefer a new bike or their older brother's hand-me-down, they're going to want the new bike. And I think we're putting the children in the position where they ought not to be. They're not the policymakers here, and we ought to respect the fact that they are students. And there were some of those students from Franklin who were as sincere could be, and they're going to learn, they're going to succeed, notwithstanding the fact they don't have a claiming law.
But when a student says, I would be willing to give up some of my advantages for the sake of greater equality, doesn't that touch you in some way?
Well, that's not what all the students said. And if you listen to the fellow in Texas, he certainly wasn't happy about that. He said,
that's what made me proud of the New Hampshire students, is that attitude.
That's correct.
Of a willingness to share and an understanding of the situation in New Hampshire and a desire to do something about it. I was proud of those students.
But none of those students, I think
students in Franklin, those kids in Franklin are trapped in Franklin because their parents cannot move. They cannot move. The value of the houses in Franklin are low. The only place where low-income people, moderate-income people can afford to buy houses is the Franklins and the Pittsfields and the Allenstowns. And if money didn't make a difference, people would be moving into Allen. You'd be moving to Allenstown.
Because I'd like to move on to our next caller. Gilda from Marlboro, go ahead.
Hello. This past weekend, our community passed its school budget, and our school board had to make some very deep cuts into art and music, physical education. They took out foreign language for our middle school. And the problem we were having is our special ed costs skyrocketed. And because of that, we had to cut the regular education budget. Is something going to be done to equalize special ed funding?
Yeah, we're looking at that right now. As a matter of fact, the State Board has a task force in place for that. But you should understand that a lot of that is driven by the federal government. And one of the reasons we're very skeptical even about a Goals 2000 program, frankly, the federal government says there's very little money to support special education, but puts a lot of mandates on us. And so we're trying to figure our way out of that to try to relieve some of the burden and yet still meet the needs of the children who deserve.
Are we suffering under unfunded mandates that were imposed years ago?
Absolutely. There's no question about that. 10 years ago, we were spending $550 million in public dollars for education, 40 million of which went to special education. Today, we spend $1.1 billion with $140 million for special education. That's more than 3 times the increase at the rate 10 years ago, yet we've only doubled public education dollars in those 10 years. And that's a lot of money, frankly. Doubling is quite impressive for a state that allows the local people to decide how much they're going to spend.
And one of the problems with special education is that, especially in small school districts, a small number of pupils who've moved into the district, who've become of school age, who become eligible for these programs, suddenly changes the local budget considerably. In the larger districts, this is not much of a problem. Statistically, things sort of work out. But in small districts like Marlboro and Unity a couple years ago, there was a big problem. Those districts are hurt, and the state has a way to assist with some of that funding, but certainly not as much as many of the districts would like.
Okay, let's go to our next caller. We have somebody in Franklin. Randy in Franklin, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to ask Mr. Lamontagne a question.
Certainly.
Overall, I think you're correct that some of the certainly school districts are doing very well, but there are those many school districts that are slipping through the cracks, that are having a very difficult time. Do you really think it's fair, the disparities between some of the Franklins and the Sauhegan High School? Do you really feel that's fair?
Well, again, it depends how you define fair. If you define fair in that Sauhegan has a climbing wall and Franklin doesn't, then that's not a definition I'm willing to accept. I think what's fair is in terms of how well the students can do academically, and I also feel that that is really the focus we ought to have. The way we have structured public education in the state is to set a foundation level of support that assumes that the children will be able to be provided what is necessary academically and from a character and citizenship.
But that's never been fully funded.
Well, that's
the whole
well, Ovide, and the bill,
the fully funded issue is irrelevant.
You're in the governor's bill. Senate Bill 173 makes this magical claim now that foundation aid is fully funded at $35 million. That's what that bill says.
Well, we can have the debate as to what the level of foundation support is, but the fact is
we don't provide it.
We have tried to articulate a foundation level, and the differences beyond that are the differences that exist among the communities. And it is going to be the case, it is the case in Texas after 30 years of litigation, that there are differences among school districts. The question is, do we change the public funding system?
I think, though, that possibly what the caller was getting at was we also saw in the documentary that there was teachers in Franklin that were dealing with 190 students in a day. And I guess just the question that arises is what kind of teaching can be done and what kind of learning could be done in that sort of environment. And I think that's where the fairness probably comes closest to the surface.
Well, the other question is, why is it that Franklin is spending the level it's spending as well? We really didn't hear anything about that. And there's been a strong taxpayer movement in Franklin. I would suggest to you that Franklin really is an aberration in a sense. It's anecdotal evidence that Mr. Murrow points to. If you look at the other plaintiff school districts, they're all spending at about the same level as Amherst is spending to support Sauhegan. So the differences aren't really there. The challenge here in the lawsuit is the tax system. It's not an education suit, it's a tax suit. Okay. And they've used education as the bad.
All right, let's get to our next call.
I want to disagree with that a second, because if the money suddenly appeared out of the blue and it was not a tax issue, it was simply placed out here, some donor was going to give us all this money, the question of how to distribute that's still a legitimate question. It's still legitimate to ask whether an equal amount shouldn't go for each pupil, right?
Well, and we have a formula to do that. It can be improved on.
We don't have a formula to do that.
Okay, well, we are going to go to our next caller here, though. Frank in Medford, go ahead, Frank.
Yes, I think that my question is, how can we hope to attract businesses and industry and a very good population to the state when our dirty little secret of education funding is getting wider and wider publicity, not being exploited, but being publicized? And I think children's expectations are lowering, and we're going to be dead right about our tax policy, and kids are going to be shafted.
The data just doesn't support that.
What's going to happen is what's happening already, in that those communities that have a strong tax base are the ones that attract the industry. The paper de-inking plant wants to go to Bow, where the taxes are low. You find development in some of the seacoast communities that have low taxes. And so what's going to happen is that the Franklins and the Pittsfields are going to have less economic development. Economic development is going to be centered in those areas that already have it, and so the disparities are going to grow unless the state realizes that and takes some role in minimizing those disparities. I'm not talking about equality necessarily, but there are certain level, liken it to buying a car. Your $400 car is going to break down on you every day. You do not need a $50,000 Mercedes to get you to work. But someplace between $12,000 and $18,000, you can buy a car that runs. And this is what we need to do. We need to bring everyone up in education terms to that level of a car that's an adequate transportation model.
The caller begins with a false premise. The fact is New Hampshire, for the second year in a row, as determined by Healthy Kids, is the best state, in the country in which to raise a child. And they look at education as one of the components. And the Annie Casey Foundation, which funded the Merrill Report, is the one that funds this report. This is not a conservative group. And again, if you're looking at comparing New Hampshire to the rest of the country, look at the gross data.
But I'm not looking at the averages. On the average, we do very well. What we need to do is to focus on our disparities and how to minimize those disparities. My friend Senator McLean has my favorite quote. If I'm standing with one foot in a bucket of ice water and the other foot in a bucket of boiling water, on average, I'm comfortable. And that's what we need to do.
I'll leave you with that image because we are going to go to Peter in Enfield. Go ahead, Peter.
Hi. You're all learned gentlemen. So the question I'm asking here basically is when you start to look at education funding, you could also look at the idea of saving money as well as spending the money. And the area that I think needs to be taken a look at, and there has been a study by the state, is the SAU system. And it's showing that it's one, outdated, it's bureaucracy we could save $27 million. Could you gentlemen please comment on that and explain to me why we even have that system at all?
Well, is there a lot of waste? Is there money to be saved?
Let me answer a little bit of the history of it. It was created in about 1919. It was created at the same time that the State Board of Education was created, and the purpose of it was to provide for some coordination.
It's the school administrative units, the SAU.
Yes, SAUs, the school administrative units. They were really supervisory unions in the beginning, and the idea was to provide for some sort of common base of understanding as to what needed to go on in the school districts. And they do cost a lot of money, too much money. I have no problem with the fact that we have too many of them, but we have left that up to sort of local decisions as to whether school districts want to pull out of SAUs and create their own and create another structure. Can we change that? Yes. But even if we could cut that money in half and save $13 million, that's about 1% of the total cost of education in this state. So while maybe it should be done, don't look to that as a solution to this question of where do we find money to fund education.
But I think the caller has a very good point. The focus isn't the public funding of education as a tax matter. The focus in terms of proving education is in the delivery system. And if you would like to really make a change, you need to contact the House Education Committee, which at the present moment has resisted meaningful change to the SAU structure. The law requires every school district to be in an SAU, and the Merrill Report pointed out the percentage increase of administrative costs in public education. And that isn't, New Hampshire...
Certainly, that's a nationwide phenomenon.
The State Board of Education could go from 63 SAUs to 1 tomorrow. It currently has that legal authority.
But the law...
All the law says there has to be an SAU structure. You could have a statewide SAU. You have that legal authority to do that today. The State Board, the Education Committee has re-referred the bill to study SAUs, and for you to point the finger at the Education Committee as being the block, I think is disingenuous.
Well, gentlemen, we're going to go to Steve in Nashua to see what Steve, go ahead.
Yes, hi there. First of all, I want to commend the social studies teacher in Franklin who said that he has an 11-year-old textbook and that he has to take what was in the information there and apply it to nowadays. But my main point is I grew up in the Midwest, in Minnesota, and I lived in Wisconsin and Michigan. Michigan has the Robin Hood law. A school district in Michigan actually went broke before the end of a school year. Kids could not go to school as of May. They transferred to other schools in Wisconsin just to be able to finish their education. In Wisconsin, you're talking about an education system that is beyond compare when you're talking out here. The Midwest is so much far advanced, and I tell you, with the tax situation out there and stuff like that, they are able to fund their kids. Kids up in the northern part of Wisconsin that are just as poor as Franklin cannot or do get as much of an education as the rest of Wisconsin. Why can't the kids up in northern New Hampshire get the same education as the kids in southern New Hampshire?
Because the politicians in this state are more determined to preserve the tax status quo than they are to improve educational quality and equal opportunity.
And the mistake Dennis makes is to think that the change in the tax structure is going to have an impact on education, and it is not. It is not a function of money at this point. We have seen such an increase in the public expenditure of dollars to support public education nationwide and in the state without meaningful changes in academic performance and achievement. We need to change the delivery system.
Come to Pittsfield, come to Allenstown and tell me it's not about
certainly
money.
Look there, and that's where we have our assessment program, which is going to start really looking at
We look at this
performance.
program that we just watched. I mean, the differences between Sauhegan and Franklin are startling.
And
They're
if you-
astounding. And we ought to be moving in the direction of trying to equalize those differences. And we can do that without changing the tax
Let
structure.
me ask
But
over-
we can begin to move in that direction. We took $900 million of the Medicaid scam, not $1 went to education. It all went into the state's bureaucracy. We have new taxes every year. Not one dime of it finds its way to local public schools.
Let me ask you the question about that was in the Merrill report about 1/3 of the kids in Franklin in the high school are taking the SATs and presumably going on to college, and about 85% in Sauhegan. How do you explain that?
And that's exactly the question I was going to ask you. What do you infer from that? Is it because we don't spend enough dollars in the high school that the students don't take that more students don't take the SATs? I don't think so. I think it's a demographic function. It's a function of the community that's there. I think the better decision would be not increasing the dollars spent at Franklin, but opening up the doors of surrounding schools to a choice or a voucher system,
But
and to
doesn't this
allow
get down
competition
to-
and allow other
doesn't
schools to serve these students.
Doesn't this get down, Ovid, though, to the notion that money means nothing?
No, money doesn't mean nothing. It doesn't mean everything, though. And the suggestion here that we should equalize, or we can equalize the disparities or the differences between Amherst and Sauhegan and Franklin, I just don't think is a function of money.
All right, I'm going to go to my next caller here, and then we'll get back to you,
more
Doug.
callers, go ahead.
Herbert in Kingston, go ahead, Herbert.
Thank you. Good evening. I'd like to broaden the perspective out a little bit and make an observation and ask for your comments on that. In 1989, the equalized school tax rate in New Hampshire was $9.54. 4 years later, in 1993, it was $15.80, an increase of 63% in 4 years. What that means, quite simply, is when you put your child in school in the first grade, by the time that child comes out in 12th grade, the equalized portion of the school tax rate will have quadrupled. How long can this go on?
Well, one of the difficulties in that figure is that in that period of time we had a real estate collapse, and so your $140,000 house in some of these communities all of a sudden was worth $90,000, and that gets reflected in the equalized valuation. And that's been particularly true in commercial property. So that figure doesn't accurately reflect what's going on. I think Doug can...
I would make one other point about it. You will see that increase, and I think you're going to continue to see more increases in the tax rate since property values are not increasing very rapidly. But if you go back and you look, as I did just recently in anticipation of this program, if you go back 50 years to 1943, since 1943 until 1993, we've had an increase of 10.8% a year, almost consistently, year in and year out for 50 years in the cost of education. What's been happening in the last 4 or 5 years is not at all unusual. It's right in line with what's been going on for over 50 years.
Okay, actually, there was one thing I wanted to get to, and that's a fairly new poll from UNH that showed that actually 2/3 of New Hampshire residents do approve of redistribution of education funding to the poorer districts, but also more than half of those same residents said that they would oppose any statewide property tax to accomplish that. So I'm wondering, given that that's probably off the table, it's failed also in the electoral field, how do we raise the money to redistribute?
Well, we have a number of ways I think we can raise it. We have the business enterprise tax. We have our current tax structure where we have selective sales taxes. We could broaden some of those selective sales taxes without taxing groceries and clothing. We could go to an entertainment tax. We could increase some of the existing taxes. I mean, there are ways to do it short of a broad-based tax. Those would not be as efficient, but they certainly could be effective in working on the disparities.
Dennis, I think it's a little ludicrous to think that an entertainment tax would raise anywhere near enough money to do something about it.
Not enough entertainment?
I mean, the reality is that a value-added tax or an income tax, a large tax, you got to be talking $250 million to make any impact here. So to pretend that you can do this by nickel and diming is the same thing that's been going on in a lot of ways for many years.
Okay.
I would say one thing. I want to agree with Ovid about the choice issue. You know, the other way of dealing with this is not redistribute the dollars. It's to redistribute the students.
Okay. Let's go to another caller. George in Hancock. Go ahead, George.
I just want to start out by giving my admiration for Mr. Lamontagne, because I feel that he's fairly outnumbered there. He seems to be the only one who has the basic philosophy of local control of education and seems to be concerned with the quality of education. But the point I want to make is, and he's doing a good job holding up against the tide. The point I want to make is that what evidence is there that your spending, if you had a uniform spending per student, what evidence is there that would translate into higher achievement levels? And isn't it true that New Hampshire students are performing better than students in other areas where they spend much more per student?
Can I just answer that as quickly as I can?
Yeah.
First of all, I think your question is an excellent one. I don't believe that if you use the existing system and you increase spending, you're going to have any meaningful change in academic achievement and performance. All you have to do is look at Canada, just as an example. The province of Quebec, 90% of the public education dollars come from the province or the national government. 10%, or about $400 to $700 per home, is paid in property taxes, and they complain about dropout rates, illiteracy, and so forth. I mean, internationally, if we look at the sharing of the cost of education, the results are no different. We have to change the way we look at delivering education.
And actually, we're approaching our final minutes, so what I would ask you to do each briefly is to return to the central point of the documentary and say, is there some common ground for us to reach a solution of who will pay for education now? I'll let you go first, Ovide.
I think we are there already, and I mean that with all sincerity. We should have as much money as possible being raised and spent locally. We have mechanisms in place now at the state level to help support public education. The debate should be on the amount of that support, and we're having that as we speak. But the basic ingredients to a sound educational system are in place in New Hampshire, and nowhere else in the country do we have a better result than we have.
When the state of New Hampshire, through the Foundation Aid Program, contributes about 4% of the total cost of education, we have a long way to go before we can have anything approaching equal opportunity for all of the students in the state of New Hampshire.
Doug, you get the final word.
Well, I'd just like to address the issue of local control, because the last caller raised it. And one of the sort of red herrings that's thrown in here is the local control issue. Right now, in Farmington, over half of the school budget is supported by the state. Okay. And nobody is going to argue that they have less local control than New London or Nashua.
Thank you very much. And that is all the time we have on this edition of New Hampshire Tonight. But before we go, just a reminder that next week we'll take a special hour-long look at the North Country, its people and its economy. We'll provide a toll-free number for everyone to join in, so don't miss New Hampshire's North Country, The Struggle to Stay. Until then, thanks for joining us, and good night.
If you missed part of this edition of New Hampshire Tonight, or you'd just like to see it again, tune in Saturday at 5 for a rebroadcast here on New Hampshire Public Television. And remember to tune in next Wednesday night at 7:30 for a special one-hour edition of New Hampshire Tonight. Production of New Hampshire Tonight is made possible in part by grants from Chubb Life America, a member of the Chubb Group of Insurance Companies, which provides property, casualty, life, and health protection through independent agents and brokers. By NYNEX, making the world of communications a whole lot simpler. And by Bank of New Hampshire, dedicated to providing the information customers need to make sound financial decisions.